The door slammed shut behind him, its sound echoing sharply through the empty apartment. I froze, my breath catching as I turned to face him. His expression was tense, his eyes dark with a feeling I couldn't quite identify. Before I had a chance to ask what was going on, he moved toward me, closing the space between us in a single step. His hand, warm and steady, brushed my cheek as he pulled me closer. And then, without any warning, his lips were on mine. It wasn't a soft kiss. It was urgent, filled with an intensity one hadn't felt from him in years. My thoughts raced, struggling to process what was happening. This wasn't the man I had known all this time. That kiss felt like a confession, like a desperate plea for something. But for what? I pulled away, breathless, my heart hammering in my chest. But what was that? I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair and clenched his jaw. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "We need to talk." Those 4 words sent a chill through me. I'd heard them before, but never like this. This wasn't the kind of conversation that ended with an apology or a simple misunderstanding. No, this felt like something more. Something far more complicated. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. It felt like the air right before a storm. I wanted to ask him what was going on, but the words wouldn't come. Something told me I wasn't ready for the answer. Finally, he looked into my eyes, and I saw something unexpected, guilt, but also a strange longing. Whatever he was about to say, I knew it would change everything. And it all began with that kiss. The days that followed were filled with an unbearable quiet. We went through our routines, work, dinner, the usual. But something had shifted. I could feel it in the way he avoided my gaze, and how his touch lingered just a bit too long. It was like he wanted to say something, but didn't know how. One Tuesday evening, as we sat at the dinner table, the clink of our forks against plates was the only sound breaking the silence. He cleared his throat, pulling my attention to him. His face was tense once again, that same expression from the night of the kiss. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, carefully, weighing his words. "What if we tried something different?" I frowned, unsure of where this was headed. "Different?" I repeated, my voice tinged with both curiosity and unease. He nodded, setting his fork down. His eyes locked with mine, and for the first time in days, he didn't look away. "I've been thinking about us. About what we might be missing. What if we tried something new together?" The vagueness of his words only unsettled me more. The weight of the conversation pressed heavily on my chest. I didn't know how to respond, so I just stared at him, waiting for him to continue. My stomach churned with a mix of dread and curiosity. He paused for a moment, then leaned in slightly, his voice dropping lower. "What if we explored something with other people?" The room felt smaller, the air thicker. I blinked, trying to make sense of what he had just said. It felt like the ground had cracked beneath us, threatening to swallow everything whole. His words hung in the air, impossible to ignore. I didn't know how to reply. My mind was racing, my heart pounding, but no coherent thoughts came out. "Other people?" I finally whispered, the words feeling strange even as I said them. He nodded, his expression serious but strangely calm, as if this idea had been brewing in his mind for some time. "I know it sounds crazy, but it's not just about that. It's about us. I think it could bring something new to our relationship. Something we're missing." I sat there, frozen, trying to make sense of his words. "Missing something?" I asked, my voice cracking. He reached across the table, gently taking my hand in his. His grip was firm, yet tender. "Carolina, it's not about something being wrong. I just think there's something we haven't explored yet. Something that could bring us closer." I stared at him, feeling like the ground beneath me was shifting. The man I had known for years, the one I had shared everything with, was asking for something I hadn't expected. Confusion, fear, and curiosity all collided within me, leaving me speechless. "We don't have to decide anything now," he added quickly, sensing my hesitation. "I don't want to pressure you into anything. Just think about it. We can talk more when you're ready." I pulled my hand away, the emptiness in the room palpable. And if I'm not ready? If I can't? I trailed off, unable to finish the thought. He didn't respond immediately. His silence spoke louder than words ever could. I stood up, needing space, needing air. I need to think, I muttered as I walked away from the table and into the quiet of our living room. I realized that this wasn't just about making a decision. It was about us, about whether we could ever return to how things were. The decision came quietly, almost like an acceptance that settled over me, like the calm before a storm. Weeks passed, and the tension between us only grew. Neither of us brought up the conversation again, but I could feel it lingering, unspoken, but always there. Then, one night, as we sat in the dim light of our bedroom, he spoke again. "Let's take a trip," he said, his voice soft but determined. "Just you and me, away from everything. We can think about everything." I didn't respond immediately. Part of me wanted to resist, to stay in the comfort of our routine. But something deeper, a quiet curiosity, urged me forward. "Where?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's a house in the mountains. Quiet, secluded," he explained. "We can escape everything, and just talk. No pressure." Something about his tone seemed too rehearsed, like he had planned this long before now. Still, I agreed, telling myself that this trip would be a chance for us to reconnect, to understand where we stood before diving into something so uncertain. The drive dragged on, the road twisting and turning as the sun sank lower in the sky. The silence between us felt heavier than before, broken only by the hum of the engine. I stared out the window, watching the blur of trees pass by, my mind caught in a whirl of confusion. What was I doing? Why had I agreed to this? Even so, there was something deep inside me telling me I needed answers. I had to understand why this mattered so much to him. When we finally arrived, the house was exactly as he had described, secluded, nestled in the trees with a stunning view of the mountains in the distance. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, like something was off. There was no one around for miles, just the two of us, and the soft, eerie sound of the wind through the pines. We unpacked quickly, both of us silent. I could feel his eyes on me as I moved around the cabin, but I kept my gaze elsewhere, not wanting to meet his. It wasn't until later that evening, when we were each holding a glass of wine, that he finally broke the silence. "They'll be here tomorrow," he said, his voice quiet and steady. I froze. "Who? What?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling slightly. "The women," he said, his tone cautious, like he was gauging my reaction. "They'll be here in the afternoon." I set my glass down, the sound of it clinking against the table far too loud. "You already invited them?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He nodded, looking at me seriously. "I thought it'd be easier this way. Less time to second-guess everything. But it's your choice. If you're not ready, we can call it off." The weight of his words hit me hard. I had thought this trip was a chance for us to talk things through, to figure out where we stood. But now it felt like everything was rushing ahead. They were already on their way. I stood up, the walls of the cabin suddenly feeling too tight around me. "I need some air," I muttered, walking out onto the porch. The cool mountain air hit me like a splash of cold water. I took a deep breath, trying to clear my mind. I could hear the wind rustling through the trees, the faint chirp of a bird in the distance. But my mind was too loud. What was I doing here? How had I let it get to this point? Part of me wanted to run back inside, to tell him it was too much, that I couldn't do this. But there was another part of me, the part that had agreed to come in the first place, that kept me rooted to the spot. As the sky darkened and stars began to prick the sky, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. No matter how much I wanted to leave, a part of me was undeniably curious. Curious about what this would mean for us, about what could change, whether it was good or bad. I turned back toward the cabin, the soft light spilling from the window, and took another breath. Tomorrow was coming, whether I was ready for it or not. The next morning arrived too quickly. I woke up with a tight feeling in my stomach, unsure of how the day would unfold. My husband was already up, moving around the kitchen like everything was normal, but it wasn't. We both knew today was different. I sat quietly, sipping my coffee, trying to ignore the constant ticking of the clock on the wall. It felt like I was waiting for something I couldn't stop, no matter how hard I tried. The air in the cabin was thick with unspoken tension, and every movement felt heavy, as if we were both holding our breath. Around noon, I heard the sound of a car approaching. My heart skipped a beat. I set my cup down and glanced at my husband, who had stopped what he was doing. His hand gripped the edge of the counter, his eyes fixed on the window. "They're here," he said softly, more to himself than to me. I stood up slowly, feeling unsteady on my feet. I wasn't ready for this. But it was too late. The doorbell rang, its sound jarring in the tense quiet of the cabin. My husband moved toward the door, and I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. When the door opened, they were standing there, 2 women. They stepped inside like they had been invited over for years, smiles warm and familiar. But I felt anything but comfortable. They were both effortlessly stunning, real, confident, completely at ease, like they had done this 100 times. I, on the other hand, felt like a stranger in my own body. We exchanged polite greetings, but the air was thick with the understanding of why they were there. We all knew the reason they were here, and no amount of small talk could hide it. I tried to keep my composure, but inside, my thoughts were racing. The wine in my glass did little to calm my nerves. It barely helped drown out the storm of questions in my head. How had we gotten here? Why was I letting this happen? At some point, the tone of the conversation shifted, almost imperceptibly. I watched as one of the women, a tall brunette with dark eyes, moved closer to my husband. Her laugh was soft, almost melodic, as she placed her hand on his arm. The gesture felt casual, almost too familiar. He looked at her, then at me, as if checking my reaction. I swallowed hard, not sure how to respond. The other woman, a petite blonde, sat beside me, her presence warm yet unobtrusive. I felt her eyes on me, studying me like she was trying to figure out my place in all of this. Then, without warning, she leaned in. Her breath brushed against my cheek as she whispered, "You seem nervous. Is this too much?" I turned toward her, surprised by how direct she was. She wasn't prying, but there was something understanding in her voice, almost reassuring. For a split second, I felt calm, a peace I hadn't expected. But before I could speak, she moved even closer. Her hand gently touched mine, and in a moment that felt almost natural, her lips brushed mine. It wasn't planned. It wasn't forced. It just happened. The kiss was soft, brief, like an unspoken question lingering between us. I pulled back, not out of rejection, but out of disbelief. My husband was sitting right across from me, his eyes wide, watching it all unfold. His face was unreadable, a mixture of shock and something else I couldn't place. But it didn't matter. It was too late now. The line had been crossed, and there was no turning back. The atmosphere in the room shifted, more tangible now, as if we had all silently agreed to continue. The brunette had leaned further into my husband, and I saw her tilt her head toward him from the corner of my eye. He hesitated, casting a quick glance my way, but this time there was no uncertainty in his eyes, only a quiet resolve. And then it happened. They kissed. It wasn't rushed or uncomfortable. It was slow, deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. I stood there, watching them, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts, yet somehow strangely calm. It wasn't jealousy that gripped me in that moment. No, it was something much more complicated. It was the dawning realization that we had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching as my life unraveled before me, like I was a spectator in a story that wasn't even mine, and I wondered what would be left of us when it was all over. The cabin seemed smaller as the evening wore on. The air felt thick and oppressive. The casual ease of earlier had evaporated, replaced by a silence so heavy it made every movement feel like an explosion. The women moved about the space effortlessly, as though they belonged here. I, on the other hand, felt like an intruder in my own life, powerless to stop what was happening around me. I sat at the table, watching everything unfold. My husband and the brunette were on the couch now, sitting much closer than before, their shoulders almost touching. The blonde, the one who had kissed me, lingered nearby, her eyes darting between me and the couple on the couch. I could sense she was trying to gauge how I was handling it all, but honestly, I wasn't sure myself. My emotions were a tangled mess: fear, confusion, and something I couldn't name. The fire crackled quietly in the hearth, but it did nothing to warm me. I felt cold, my heart racing as I tried to figure out if I was okay with any of this. It wasn't about the kiss anymore. That was just the spark, igniting something much bigger than I was prepared for. Now, I was staring at a version of my life that I couldn't recognize. My husband turned slightly, his eyes briefly meeting mine. There was something in that glance, something between uncertainty and anticipation. He was waiting for some sort of sign, some reaction from me, but I had nothing to offer. I was just as lost as he was. I stood up abruptly, needing to breathe, needing to get away. "I'm going outside for a minute," I murmured, barely audible over the tension that clung to the room. No one stopped me. The night air hit me like a cold slap. I stood there, staring up at the stars, their light feeling distant, unreachable, as if I were too far removed from everything to touch them. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to hold it together. The weight of everything we had been through over the past few weeks, was suffocating, making it hard to catch my breath. I didn't know how long I was outside, lost in my thoughts, but eventually, I heard the door creak open behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The blonde stepped beside me, her footsteps soft against the wooden porch. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly, her voice surprisingly gentle, as though she understood the storm raging inside me. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." She didn't speak right away. Instead, she just stood beside me, letting the silence between us stretch on. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke again. "You can stop this, at any time." I swallowed hard, the words settling heavily in my chest. "I'm not sure stopping would change anything anymore," I replied, barely above a whisper. She didn't push me. She didn't try to convince me. She simply stood next to me, letting me wrestle with the decision. It was mine to make. And as I stood there, staring into the dark, I realized something. The point of no return had already passed. I stayed outside longer than I had planned, the cool air doing little to quell the storm inside me. My mind was spinning, tangled in a mess of conflicting emotions. What had I allowed to happen? Could we ever go back to what we had? Eventually, I forced myself to turn around and go back inside. The warmth of the cabin hit me like a physical presence, but it did nothing to comfort me. The scene that greeted me was more surreal than ever. My husband was still on the couch, the brunette now sitting even closer to him, their bodies nearly touching. When I entered, they both looked up at me, their eyes searching, waiting for some kind of response. I moved toward the edge of the room and sat down, keeping a distance from them. The blonde, who had been so kind to me outside, sat nearby without saying a word. She simply watched, and I could feel her trying to gauge my emotions, sensing the discomfort that had settled over everything. The silence hung thick and awkward until finally, my husband broke it. "Carolina," he said softly, his voice tentative. "We don't have to continue if you're not ready." But the way he glanced at the brunette made it clear that he was hoping for something else. I looked between them, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I knew we had already gone too far. There was no turning back now. I thought back to the conversation we'd had weeks ago, the hints, the subtle nudges that had led us to this moment. How had it all spiraled so quickly? The brunette shifted slightly, leaning toward my husband, her hand resting casually on his arm. It was such a small, simple gesture, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't stay here and watch this unfold any longer. I felt like an outsider in my own life, watching as everything I had once understood slipped away. Without thinking, I stood up again, the weight of the moment sinking deep into my stomach. My voice trembled as I spoke. "I can't do this. I thought I could, but I can't." The words came out faster than I meant them to, but once they were said, they hung in the air like a sentence that couldn't be undone. My husband's face shifted, disappointment flickering across his features. He opened his mouth, as if to say something, but I couldn't hear it. I didn't want to hear it. I was done pretending, done trying to make sense of this. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice stronger now. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I couldn't stay here. Not like this. The blonde stood up, stepping toward me. "You don't have to go," she said softly, her voice calm yet firm. "Take a moment. Breathe. Come back when you're ready." But I wasn't ready, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I can't." I turned toward the door, every step feeling like a mile as I reached for the handle. I heard my husband's voice behind me, soft and pleading. "Carolina, please don't go like this. We can figure this out." But his words felt hollow, like they were coming from someone I didn't recognize. I paused, my hand still on the door handle. Part of me wanted to turn around, to see him again, to find some trace of the man I thought I knew. But I couldn't. I opened the door and stepped into the cold night once more, the chill of the air biting at my skin, a sharp reminder that I was still here. Still real. As I walked away from the cabin, from everything that had once been familiar, I felt a strange mix of relief and loss. The drive home was silent, unnaturally so. The weight of everything that had happened felt suffocating, making it hard to breathe. The cabin, the women, the kiss. It all felt like a dream, one I couldn't quite wake up from. But the pit in my stomach reminded me that it was real. As I pulled into the driveway, I stared at the front door. It looked so ordinary, but stepping inside felt like an insurmountable task. The house that had once felt like home now seemed distant, unfamiliar, as though I no longer had a place there. The silence of the night pressed against the windows, and I sat in the car, unsure of where to go from here. When I finally opened the door and stepped inside, the familiar warmth of the house surrounded me. But it did little to calm the growing unease within me. I moved through the rooms, each one a reminder of the life we had built together, a life that now felt on the verge of unraveling. I checked my phone, finding several messages from him, each one more urgent than the last. I knew he would be home soon, and we would have to face whatever was left between us. But what could we even say? How do you fix something that's already shattered? I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at my phone, feeling paralyzed. My fingers hovered over the screen, ready to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Part of me wanted to pretend none of this had happened, to rewind to a time when things were simpler. But that part of me was slipping away, overwhelmed by the truth that things had changed beyond repair. As I sat there, lost in my thoughts, I heard his car pull into the driveway. My heart sank. The weight of reality hit me all at once. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The door creaked open, and his footsteps were slow, hesitant. He walked into the room, and our eyes met. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there like he was waiting for me to say something, anything. The silence between us stretched out, unbearable, filled with everything we were too afraid to voice. Finally, he broke it, his voice barely audible. "Carolina, we can't leave things like this." I swallowed, trying to find the right words, but they stuck in my throat. "I don't know how we're supposed to fix this," I replied, my voice trembling. His eyes softened, and for a fleeting moment, I thought he might say something comforting, something that would make it all better. But instead, he said something I wasn't prepared for. "Maybe we can't." His words hung in the air, heavy, final. I felt my heart tighten. 1,000 questions rushed through my mind. What did he mean? Was this the end? But before I could ask, he turned and walked toward the bedroom. The sound of his footsteps echoed down the hall, leaving me alone at the table, staring at the empty space where he had just been. And in that instant, the uncertainty I had been avoiding rushed in, swallowing me whole.